Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's panel discussion. I'd like to thank the folks at Cannabis for putting this together. Um, it's going to be an interesting conversation about a topic that is probably not the most popular topic to talk about. It's sort of the elephant in the room in the cannabis industry. And the topic is there an issue with oversaturation in the cannabis industry on the legal retail side here in Canada? And I was told many years ago that the best way to come up with a panel is to pick a topic that everyone really likes or really doesn't like. So I think that as a topic, I think this probably falls into the second category, but I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. We have some people with really distinct points of view and distinct areas of expertise. So when the legal cannabis industry was launched in Canada, one of the interesting things was there were a lot of people out there saying it's the gold rush. There's going to be a lot of people out there making money. And it happened. A lot of companies had very high valuations. There were some very strong IPOs. There were some very strong retail plays. And as we all know, as time went on, there was a boom and a bust in the industry. And of course, a recovery as well, and the industry changing shape and changing directions. So a lot of times I think about this in the context of the dot-com boom. I started Verb Factory as a marketing agency with a focus on the technology industry. I founded the agency in San Francisco prior to moving to Toronto. And I was there for the whole boom and bust. Companies like Webvan, companies like pets.com, companies like theglobe.com, that people might not necessarily remember today, but they were the high-flying companies of 1999 and 2000. Of course, what happened was the laws of economics came into play, and the first dot-com boom was a bubble that collapsed. And for a couple of years, there was a lot of uncertainty. And in a lot of ways, there are parallels to the cannabis industry and what's happening here in Canada today. But the more that I thought about it, the analogy for technology isn't quite right. Because unlike technology, which was based on ones and zeros and based on non-physical things, such as eyeballs, CPMs, and those kinds of things, cannabis is a real physical product. It's an agricultural product. It needs to be grown, it needs to be harvested, it needs to be sold, it needs to be marketed, but it is a product that in the agriculture industry. And the more that I thought about this, the more I thought about Tulip Mania. And I thought that might be a better analogy for what we're seeing in the industry today. And I was talking to some people about it, and a lot of people really didn't know Tulip Mania, or maybe knew a little bit about it. But it's regarded as the first economic bubble in the world. And there are a lot of things that happened during Tulip Mania that have parallels to today. And so before we start talking about the cannabis industry, I'd like to invite Dr. Alette Fleischer to talk. Alette Fleischer is based in the Netherlands. She's an academic, and she is one of the foremost experts on Tulip Mania. And so I'd love for Dr. Fleischer to present for a few minutes about what is Tulip Mania, so then we can talk about the cannabis industry in the context of this really interesting historical phenomenon.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, first of all, to invite me, and well, welcome to everybody being present. And yeah, I am an historian from Amsterdam, and I have tried to squeeze as much of my information in as little time as possible and still come up with a coherent story. And being a historian, I have a tend to sort of throw everything that I know about Tulip Mania onto you, but if I would do that, we'd be sitting here tomorrow still. So I'm not going to do that. So I'm cutting quite a few corners, but I thought, what you need to know about this, indeed, this product, the tulip bulb, is the cycle. Because when can you buy a tulip, when you need to plant it, etc. So what's the business model of Tulip Mania, or the tulip? Well, first of all, you begin with a bulb, like one on the left-hand side of your slide. You plant it in the fall, then you wait until winter comes, and then spring finally comes, the bulb comes up, and you have the lovely flower. And then if you're in the business for the bulb, you need at some point behead the flower. You have to take the flower head off, so all the energy can go into the pot, into the bulb, and there the one bulb will produce baby bulbs during the summer. You see that in the right-hand side slide underneath the word summer, you can see that there are bulbs forming around the mother bulb. So you take the bulb out in June, July, and then you peel away the different baby bulbs and you dry the bulbs. It's like an onion. So some onions are bigger, other onions are smaller, and then you tear away the outer shell of the onion, which is technically the bulb. And then you can actually sell the bulb. You physically have the bulb in your hand, and then you can sell it to another person. So in essence, what's the business model? Well, you start with one bulb, and then a year later, you have maybe 2 smaller bulbs, which you keep, and 3 bigger bulbs that you can sell. So you can triple your investment in a year's time. So that sounds very good, doesn't it? But the thing is, you want to maybe buy a baby bulb from a tulip before you have the tulip in your hand. And then there's another thing, what color? And here on the left-hand side of the slide, you see there's images in front at every bulb case, but you can't see from the bulb itself if it's going to be black, if it's going to be yellow, if it's going to be multicolored. And in the 17th century, the more colorful the bulb, the more outrageous the bulb, the more expensive the flower, the more expensive the bulb is. So there is an element of trust that plays part of this. So if I buy your bulb, which color do I buy? Did I buy the one that I saw in your garden in April with those lovely flares and yellows and reds colors? Do you actually sell me that bulb, or do you sell me something else? So that's, so the business model, you start with one bulb and you get 3 to sell. That's good. Then you have the element of trust. And in order to explain how much money one of the precious bulbs was, I present to you this slide. And these are 3 varieties. Well, one on the left-hand side is called the rose, the one in the middle is called the bizarre, and the one to the right-hand side of your slide is called the violet. And you see they're all sort of flamey in color. And this is actually not the quality of the tulip or tulip bulb itself. It is actually caused by a virus that makes the colors break. And where the virus is where the white. So if there's no virus, the flower on the left-hand side would just be red. But because of the virus, it's now red and white. But people did not know that at the time. The problem with a virus in the flower and in the bulb causes the bulb to deteriorate. You may have one bulb this year with a lovely flower, but the products, the baby bulbs are less strong and quite weak. So maybe you sell me a bulb that's so weak that doesn't produce a flower. So that's, I'm going to mistrust you then, big time. Or alternatively, I buy a baby bulb from that flower, and it occurs that the virus is not in that particular baby bulb. And hey presto, in April, I have a neutral red bulb. So I will accuse you of, cheating, selling me the wrong bulb. But how expensive were these bulbs? So in April, I see your flower and I want that particular bulb. And I ask you to reserve the right for me to buy that flower. And I pay you money for that particular voucher. It's like a futures trade. So I own the right to buy that particular bulb. So I come back in July, you have the dried big bulb, you weigh it, and the weight goes per ass, AAS, not ASS, although at the end you may be asked rather than being clever. And And it's the measure that is against the gold. It's the same weight as you use in gold trade. And you weigh the bulb, and for instance, the one on the left-hand side, the reddish one, is selling for 6 guilders per as, which means that one bulb is 1,500 guilders. How much money is that? Well, a carpenter in the early 17th century a good carpenter would get paid about 300 guilders per year. So it's a lot of money, a lot of money. The one in the middle is relatively cheap with 235 guilders. So you want to be in on the game. You are, you want to think, I have a garden, I can mortgage my house, and next year I can pay off my house because I have 3 baby bulbs to be selling to somebody else. And if I go to this slide, so what you have then? You have people who initially started the whole tulip trade, the tulip bulb business. These were people who had knowledge. These were the professionals. They were, the botanists, the people who knew about tulips. But then you get people who think, I can do that. You don't need to be, Einstein to plant a bulb and get the bulb out. So a lot of people started to mortgage their houses or try to sort of create debts, started to buy up the tulips. And then another part was, remember the voucher I talked about in the other slide? Then there was the trade of the vouchers themselves. So in February, when you see that the prices are going down, this occurred in a cafe where all the traders, the sellers and the buyers of these vouchers were at. And a voucher, so I could be the first owner of this voucher to buy your bulb, but I could sell it on and making a profit, and you can sell it on, etc., etc. So there was a big, and it's called a wind trade, because the voucher is actually represents nothing. It represents the right to buy. Now the thing is, the person who has the voucher, the right to buy, officially does not need to buy the bulb. You can refrain from buying the bulb, but that is actually considered dishonesty. So you break, in fact, the agreement that the person holding the voucher should buy that bulb, although you don't need to, but it was like a gentleman's agreement. So there was debts, there was the mistrust regarding bulbs, because in your garden you suddenly have a very tiny, lousy bulb or a single colored one. So you were sold the wrong bulb. So that's what caused unrest, the unrest of dishonesty, of you're not able to live up to your word. And actually, if you were a good gentleman and you were not interested in actually cashing in your voucher, you're buying the tulips, you were expected to sort of hand over some money as a compensation. That was like part of the gentleman's agreement. And if you even didn't do that, then you create even further unrest and dishonest feelings. And with so many non-professionals in the business who were not sort of held by this gentleman's agreement idea, that was sort of shook the whole ground and let the prices fall down. Actually, we think that a lot of people were in absolutely financial despair after this, that the Dutch economy was absolutely flat out, was really down zero. In all fairness, that was not really that much the case. So the economy did suffer, but not to the extent as later bubbles like 1929. But it was propagated by people after the collapse, after the fall in prices, that people who were in this business were all about greed. They were being foolish. You have no idea what a tulip bulb does. Let's say you are in the textile industry and you thought, I'm going to do this as an extra job along the side to get rich quick. That was the foolishness. And that was all propagated in articles and in paintings and in prints. And of course, the other thing at that time was still very much a strong argument that being a lazy worker, going for the quick dollar, being foolish and greedy is going against God. So to recap, because I don't want to take too much of your time, it was the ephemeral beauty of the tulip flower continued to be praised. The prices were still quite expensive, but not ridiculously expensive. But this idea of borrowing money against something collateral and getting, following one person and going after it like crazy is something that we know of all centuries. And just to sort of end, I thought it was kind of funny. What causes the virus? Well, this aphid brings the virus from a peach to the tulip on the left-hand side, and this plant, the Cannabis sativa, of course, can also suffer from the same mosaic virus. And I'm going to open up my chat, and there is a question by, oops, sorry about this, stop share. I'm just going to stop share for a second and go back to the chat. Yes.
Thank you. So we have a question here. And by the way, if anyone has any questions, we're not going to wait until the end for the questions. We can answer them at any time. So I'm just going to read this out loud for people who can't say, and this is a question for Dr. Fleischer. And this is actually more about the cannabis industry in the Netherlands. And so I don't know if you're necessarily an expert on the cannabis industry in the Netherlands. So this question might not be appropriate, but I'll throw the question out there, which is, why is Amsterdam making it lately very strict for the recreational market for visitors coming to the Netherlands? And we should mention Dr. Fleischer is based in the Netherlands. So maybe you can answer that one very quickly.
Yeah. So we have such a weird system, but in essence, in Amsterdam, you can buy cannabis, whether you're a local or whether you're a tourist. There are coffee shops, so that's how we call those shops. We can have coffee shops along the German Dutch border and the Belgium Dutch border, where it's not allowed for tourists, for Germans to pop in and over the border to get their cannabis. But yeah, it still is very much possible, and for you as a tourist or Italian, wherever you come from, you come to Amsterdam, you can pop down any coffee shop and get your hashish or your joints. As it's still illegal, there is no revenue or tax. So it's 5 grams is legal on a person, but basically a coffee shop has something illegal because they have too much of it. But you cannot have like one parcel in your shop and then sell it on and then go out and get your second like sachel. So it's a very shady construction here. But it's the big business is still very much owned by the criminal guys out there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fleischer. And one of the interesting things about the boom, if you noticed that it all happened in about less than a year. And one of the interesting things is that tulips are still a symbol of the Netherlands. If you go to the Netherlands now, you'll see out of your train window, you'll see fields of tulips. So even though there was a boom and bust, it's not like tulips went away. And in fact, 400 years later, it's still about a 250 million euro business. So it's one of the interesting things that even though there was this boom and bust, much like with cannabis, just when the industry started sinking, it's not like people stopped using cannabis. So with that framework in mind and talking about the boom, I'd like to hand this over to Nathan. Nathan Meissen is a consultant, expert, visionary in the cannabis industry. He's based in Edmonton, Alberta. And Nathan, I'd like you to talk for a couple of minutes about what market saturation looks like and sort of almost this boom and bust economy that Dr. Fleischer was talking about, but in the context of what we're seeing in the cannabis industry today in Canada.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. So one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that the cannabis sector is unique in the fact that we're seeing booms and busts in different segments as the segments roll out. License production came first, and we've seen significant growth and high valuations. But as we've seen the commoditization of the cannabis product, we've seen pricing go down. And what that pricing has done is it's, of course, compressed profitability for producers. And we're now starting to see that trickle down effect happening within the retail sector in some regard. Not only are there new margin opportunities, but there's also opportunities where one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind about the cannabis sector is that we're living what it is in real time as the first people who, other than poor Uruguay, and we don't want to forget about Uruguay, big ups to them for going first, but as the first G20 nation, we're the first who have done it at a federally regulated way in which the world is looking at it. And when you're doing something like this, and when you're going through legalization of a controlled stubs or a controlled product that has an incredible amount of stigma and had an incredible amount of history prior to, that it creates a regulatory environment that's very difficult between the three orders of government, and each of them put their own standards and incredible stringent requirements on them. When you actually take a cannabis retailer at the three orders of government, between the product that has to come in from the federal side to the processing allowance at or the opening allowance at a provincial side, and the municipal improvements, there's more regulations than cannabis faces than nuclear power. It is an incredible amount of due diligence that has occurred. And one of the things that is unique, and I think this is one of the things that we're seeing in real time, is we don't know what the market will bear. So you've seen an incredible growth in the retail environment, but we don't know what the top is. I think one of the interesting things to do is to find common parallels. And being in Alberta, I think we do have a common parallel there in the fact that we privatized the liquor industry when it came to liquor retail. And when that happened in the 90s, the alcohol retail got to 2,100 retail stores and then contracted by 25% down to 1,400. So that was what the top was, and then we settled out, and now there's 1,555 liquor stores in Alberta. I think what we're seeing in the retail space in cannabis is we're seeing what the top of the segment is, but we don't know what that is because, one, we're still primarily focusing on the 22 to 26% of Canadians that were consuming cannabis prior to legalization. We've made some definite inroads into that demographic. Two of my favorite statistics is since 2004 to 2019 from Stats Canada, the average age of cannabis consumers has gone from 24 to 38.9. So you've already started to see a different age demographic coming in, and the fastest age demographic for cannabis consumers coming into the market is seniors in Canada. So when you think about that, what we know right now isn't what it might be, because we need to have more opportunity to bring more people into the sector. But the sector could support, in Alberta, we have 620-ish stores. If we could bring people in through marketing rules, products that people want, 66% of Canadians who haven't consumed cannabis have stated that they would like to try it through ingestibles. We don't even know what cannabis is. We are living what it can be in real time. We could get to 1,000 stores and it might contract. It might go down again to 20% like the alcohol industry. But the neat thing about us and why the world is really watching is we don't know what the top of the market is, and we're finding that out. And Ontario is a great example. Mara is one of the first people that, came to the Ontario market. There's 600 plus stores in Ontario where they've just passed it. There's 1,700 applications for stores in the Ontario market still to come. And that's with a 30 store cap in Ontario. In September, that cap goes up where a single entity can own up to 75 stores. Could we see 3,000 stores in Ontario? We don't know. And I think that's one of the interesting things about a boom and bust cycle, that just like Tulips was, thank you very much for Dr. Fletcher, is we're living it in real time, where we don't know what the boom is or the bust is, because we don't know what market demand is. We don't know what saturation is. We don't know how many consumers are going to continue to move into the market. And all of these things are happening at the same time. And I think it'll be really interesting to keep in mind, especially in the fact that since January of 2020 and to December of 2022, the cannabis sector during a global pandemic grew by $6 billion. And the economic impact of cultivators and retailers, not ancillary businesses, just cultivators and retailers in Canada in December 2020 from Stats Canada was $17.9 billion. That's $2.1 billion less than the automotive industry in Canada. So the size and the scale and the fact that it's continued to grow even during a global pandemic, it's really fascinating to think about where we can be. And we're going to find out again in real time what saturation is, because we don't even know if we're there yet, when we'll get there, and what it'll look like. And that's something that we all have to live with. And one of the wonderful things is, for some of us who live in the cannabis sector, that dynamism was what keeps us on our toes, because between government process, between government process, regulations, marketing rules, new products, transitioning consumers, it changes day to day. Just wait a second. So I think, it's a really exciting opportunity to figure out, are we in boom and bust, and what saturation is. And there was a couple of questions. I don't know if you would like me to respond.
Yeah, so just a couple of questions here, and I'll read them out loud. I'm not sure if people can see the chat or not. So this is a question for you, Nathan.
Sure.
What was the increase during the pandemic?
It went up by $6 billion. It started the year at 11.3 billion, and it's now, as of December of 2020, so one calendar year, was $17.9 billion. And again, that's with a very different regulatory regime than any other consumer packaged good has to live with under. So we're only scratching the surface of what that can be.
Great. And there's two other questions here, one of which, Sergey, we'll get to your question later, because I think it's something we can actually talk with Mara about, who will be speaking forth. So I promise I'm not ignoring your question. I just think Mara would be the right person to answer it. And then in terms of one of the questions, can anyone open a cannabis store, or do you need a license? There is an application process. It is done by province. And what's interesting is and Mara will talk a little bit more about this, that when the first legal stores opened in Ontario, which was in April of 2019, I think there were 5 stores that opened on day one. And so if you look at seven stores on day one.
7 stores
in Ontario on day one. And Mara was with one of the original 7. So she'll talk a little bit about that. But now, I mean, they're opening every day. And one of the things, in fact, this leads into Mario. That's a great segue into what Mario is going to talk about. So we're getting clusters where you can walk down a street and literally there will be 5 or 6 stores on 1 or 2 blocks, and they're all selling cannabis. And so Mario, and I'll introduce him now, Mario Tanagutsi, based in Calgary. He's a journalist, an excellent journalist. In fact, it was an article that I read that he wrote last summer on cannabis oversaturation that gave me the idea for this discussion. And Mario does not come out of the cannabis industry, but he has written extensively on the retail industry. And so what I'd like Mario to do is talk for a couple of minutes about this clustering and what you would do when you have 5 or 6 stores selling the same product on the same block. How does that affect companies? And then what can they do to differentiate themselves and stand out when there's so much direct competition? So Mario, over to you.
Okay, yeah, it's quite an interesting topic, obviously, and um, I was focusing on a lot of what Nathan was saying. We really are in uncharted territory here, yeah, for sure, we don't know what the demand's going to be. We don't know what the consumer is going to be going into the future, but. Just a couple of some stats as well. From Statistics Canada, in 2020, Canadians bought just over $2.6 billion in legal cannabis. Uh, it was more than double from the year before. At the end of 2020, there was 1,400 licensed cannabis stores in the country, and that was almost doubled in a year. It was up from about 760 at the end of 2019. Ontario led the way, 727.5 million. Alberta was second, 573 million. When we look at the overall market, as Nathan said, we don't know where that's going. Some of the stuff that I researched that I did said it on maturity, the expectations are the market could be $5 to $8 billion on an annual basis. And I just saw a forecast just the other day where they figure that there will be a 60% growth in 2021 in the market. And that's just in sales. So yeah, the question of saturation becomes an interesting one because, and I'm glad, Nathan, you brought up the liquor store thing, because it's really an interesting parallel there, right? And for those of you who are not from Alberta, I think the privatization of the liquor stores were many years ago, right? And where before that was under the government, much like LCBO in Ontario, et cetera. But when the liquor stores were privatized, floodgates opened, right? And there was a liquor store on almost every corner. The funny thing is, and I don't know about you, Nathan, in Edmonton, but I know here in Calgary, I go down around my neighborhood and man, I don't know, I see so many liquor stores open still, right? And so obviously, we live in a society where the market dictates things. So if the demand is there, the number of stores are going to be there, because obviously, it's not profitable to run something. You're not going to beat your head against the wall for too long. So, which brings us, to the whole cannabis thing, and when it first started again in October of 2019, you had a flood of stores wanting to get involved, and it's a really interesting question of whether it's already oversaturated or not. I guess time will tell. Just like the liquor store industry in Alberta, time will tell to see which ones survive, which ones just decide to close shop. But like in any business, and then Richard, you and I had this discussion the other day. It's like any business, right? I'm walking down Stephen Avenue Mall in Calgary, and there's 6 shoe stores there. Well, how profitable is it going to be for those shoe stores to survive, right? And the key becomes, okay, what do they have to offer? What is their niche market? Yeah, granted, if you have 6 stores within 2 blocks that are selling the same stuff, some of them are not going to survive, obviously, unless the market is just crazy. But what the difference is, though, what if one place is focusing on Crocs? One place is focusing on formal footwear, and other places focusing on, sneakers or running shoes. Then there's a market for it, right? Because each one of them has their own niches. And I think that's where, things may kind of level out and unfold in the cannabis industry as well, that certain, certain retail locations focus on certain things. That's one of the differentiators. The other differentiator, of course, is customer service. And I think uniquely in the retail sector in cannabis, customer service becomes huge, right? Because you walk into a retail store and you want to deal with somebody that has some knowledge about the products and has some knowledge about what the products can do for you, et cetera, right? And this reminds me of a local Calgary store, and it's called Community Natural Food. A very niche market, but alternative, healthy food, like a little grocery store. But all its employees are very, very knowledgeable about the products they have in there. So I think that's the same thing that will happen in the cannabis industry. People will obviously gravitate to those places where that knowledge base within staff is available. And the third thing I think that differentiates places in the marketplace and retail outlets is the experience. And this is something, in general, when you look at the retail market right now, I do a lot of retail stories for Retail Insider, for example. And man, every time I'm talking to a retailer, doesn't matter who it is, whether it's a Harry Rosen to a Walmart, or et cetera, they're always talking about customer experience, quote unquote. And that becomes a differentiator as well in the market. Each of them have different feel to them. Each of them are offering different experiences, different services, et cetera, et cetera. There was one, I can't remember the name, but there, I think it's called Prairie Records, its niche is that it combines the cannabis with records and music. And so there's stuff like that out there. So that's the key. Now, again, only going back to what Nathan said, only time will tell, how many stores the market can bear. But you know what? In a free marketplace, that'll play itself out.
I should probably unmute myself. So thank you for that, Mario. And we've gotten a bunch of other questions coming in. We will get to all of the questions, I promise. What I'd like to do now, and that's really good analysis, Mario, and really, as someone who has been in the industry, the legal cannabis industry, literally as long as anyone, is Mara, who I mentioned. Mara directs operations for Realm, which is RELM. Their first store opened in Burlington, Ontario, which is to the west of Toronto. What's interesting is, unlike a lot of other cannabis stores that opened a store and then quickly expanded, it was almost 2 years before Realm opened its second store, which was in Hamilton, Ontario, which opened right around Christmas, and more recently has opened up a location in Toronto. So it's a very slow growth, which is in a lot of ways not necessarily the norm in the industry. Some people are doing that. Some people are growing very quickly. But one of the interesting things that Mara can talk about is A, how the company Realm has differentiated itself, but B, how their choice of location is helping buffer them against some of this oversaturation that we're seeing. So Mara, I'd love to turn it over to you and talk a little bit about your experience as someone who is working in the field.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me today. First and foremost, I wanted to go back on something that Nathan said. Like, we're living this in real time, which is like really, really crazy. Like, we're living through this point of history, and we're living through this in real time to see, what is actually going to happen with the entire, cannabis industry in Ontario and Canada, which is like really, really exciting. And it's really cool to kind of look back and be a part of this from day one, April 1st, 2019. So one of the things with Realm was we were really lucky to be one of the first 7 to open up in Ontario on April 1st, 2019. And we were one of the only stores in the Halton region, which I think really, really helped us. We kind of were, for lack of a better term, we really rushed to get our Burlington store up and running. So in terms of like aesthetic and customer experience, we didn't have like, sniff jars everywhere and all these like crazy bells and whistles that you're seeing in a lot of these stores that are opening up now. And I think because of that, we were really able to hone in on our customer service and our customer experience, because we didn't have all of these other bells and whistles to really wow people and be like, this is what cannabis is. It wasn't always everyone's cup of tea, but I think it really helped us with our brand to really focus on our customer experience and educating people on what, this legal cannabis market looked like, which is very, very exciting. I think it was really good. I think a lot of places are really focusing on like expanding really fast and having all these things that they think that they should have. But I think the secret is building, genuine connections with your customer and offering them, genuine advice and really educating them on the products that we're selling, instead of relying on, looking like an Apple store and having a million sniff jars everywhere, and which is what a lot of people want, which is great. But I find when you're purchasing anything and not just cannabis, you work hard for your money, and who you're giving that money to, you want to make sure that you feel comfortable with that interaction and you feel like you're making a good choice. So I think that's what's really kind of helped us to differentiate in this space. And yeah, like Richard mentioned, we are kind of slow to grow, but I think that ended up helping us in a way, because we're seeing all these oversaturated pockets of cannabis stores, so we're able to kind of really pick and choose where we want to be. But even in the stores that we're opening up right now, we were lucky enough to pick places that didn't end up being overly saturated. Right now, who knows what will happen, other than our one location on Bloor Street, which we find there's a lot of like other cannabis stores opening up around there. But I think we've been really lucky in a lot of our licenses, and they're not in like very oversaturated neighborhoods. Because I think you want to look, a lot of people, when you think about it, like, where is going to be a busy cannabis shop? Queen Street. So everybody's getting an application on Queen Street. So you have to like think a little bit more broader, I think, when you're choosing a place to open up your cannabis shop in Ontario, for instance, and you don't want to make it such an obvious place where, so many other people are going to obviously be opening up a store there. You kind of want to look at neighborhoods and think, does this neighborhood need a cannabis store? Maybe not necessarily want one. Do they need one? You know what I mean? I'm thinking about, a lot of people are looking at, okay, what's an anchor? Well, I think that you should be the anchor of the cannabis store itself. You don't really want to be looking at places where customers are already traveling to. Like, I want them to travel because we're here. You know what I mean? We're not looking to draw customers because there's other anchors around us. I think was one of the things that we decided to do as well, which ended up working out. But yeah, it's crazy. It's interesting. It's moving really fast. I think I'm very excited to see what kind of happens after COVID for cannabis and the oversaturation, because I feel like, obviously no one can predict that COVID was going to happen, but I feel like it would be really cool to see the data that comes out of this oversaturation without having the parameters of lockdowns and social distancing and having caps on the amount of customers you can have in a store, and people just not being out and about and living their normal lives as they regularly would. So I'm pretty fascinated to see what kind of statistics we see out of the oversaturation of cannabis once a lot of our normal has returned, to kind of see what that looks like for the cannabis industry.
Thank you, Mara. Obviously we've talked about a lot of different things here. We've talked about the historical antecedent of the boom and bust, which Dr. Fleischer provided. Nathan provided a really good overview of the economics of the cannabis industry. Mario talked about the retail industry as a whole and sort of how cannabis fits into those trends. And of course, Mara provided the perspective of someone working in retail, running retail operations in the cannabis industry. We have a number of questions that have popped up, and I'd really like to get to as many of them as possible. So I'm just going to plow through them as quickly as I can. And this first one is, I'll just throw this at Nathan. We have someone who wants to know, is there an estimate on the size of the illicit market in Canada?
Yeah, the Stats Canada prior to legalization did a polling, and self-identified Canadians said that 22 to 26% of the Canadian population was consuming cannabis prior to legalization. So if you think about that, and the estimate was between $6.5 and $8 billion, but of course that's an estimate. But primarily people are fighting over that populace right now, and as products come involved that allow us to transition those legacy people over, you'll potentially see that market continue to erode. But even in places like Oregon, Colorado, and Washington, which have led cannabis retail, you still see an illicit market in some regards. So I don't think you'll always transition, but it is a fairly significant population.
Thank you. So one thing that Dr. Fleischer just pointed out in her note over here is one of the reasons that prices dropped as a factor of Tulip Mania was there was an epidemic of the plague. And so obviously, having a pandemic certainly can play havoc with the numbers of any sector of the economy. And so that's an interesting thing to consider, is not only was this boom and bust going on because of irrational ebullience over pricing and speculation, but of course there was the pandemic, the plague that hit. So we have two questions here, and I think both of them are probably, Mara, you're probably the best person to answer them. So one of them has to do with the cost of legal versus illicit cannabis. And basically, I won't read the whole question because it's rather long, but it's basically pricing. It's much more expensive to buy legal cannabis than illegal cannabis. Do we think that there will be a reduction in pricing down towards $5 to $7 per gram versus $17 to $20 per gram that we're seeing today?
Yeah, for sure, because we're already seeing that happen. From April 1st, 2019 to now, we're already seeing a price reduction in a lot of different SKUs and categories that are offered, which is really exciting. And it may not be everyone's top pick, but there is a lot of value brands that are coming out as well right now, which are comparable to your $5 to $7 a gram that you'd be seeing on the illicit market. So I think that there is a lot out there that is affordable for people. So yeah.
So can I add just a little bit of piece here? Being one of the first people to help get Fire and Flower off the ground and submitting the 37 applications on March 7th of 2018, and being two of the retailers that opened on that April 1st of 2019, fought the fight and taken the punches with all the rest of us. One of the things that we have to keep in mind on normal consumer packaged goods is the role of government, right? Like the compression that it is. Let's use Alberta because it's the most egregious. So for the longest time, Alberta had the most stores in Canada, and between taxation at a provincial, federal, and service fees from the AGLC, the estimate is that each gram of cannabis in this province legally is 41.3% taxation and service fees. What other consumer packaged goods that is trying to displace an illicit sector comes in with 41.3% taxation? It's insane. So I think the role of government and regulators is something that we have to take in consideration, especially when you compare it to like Saskatchewan, who fell ass backwards into probably the most liberal regime when it comes to cannabis distribution, has cannabis that competes at or below the illegal sector because of its regulatory regime. And one last one I quickly want to add is Cannabis faces hurdles that no other sector does. A great example is when delivery. When they extended the emergency orders in Ontario, every retailer in Ontario was allowed delivery except cannabis, because of the role of the regulator in the province as a competitor who actually fixes prices and sets the taxation regime. So when we want to make true and stay true to the real reason for cannabis legalization, of keeping cannabis out of the hands of youth, which we have done an outstanding job, regulated product and displacing the illicit market, we have to make sure we keep our eyes on the regulators and the government for their role in making it difficult for that to happen.
Richard, could I ask Nathan a question?
Sure.
So I'm putting on my journalist hat now. So Nathan, here in Alberta, we've got a unique situation, right? Where not only do you have these private independent retailers opening stores, but you have a Calgary Co-op, for example, okay, yep. A grocery chain that has opened, and I don't know how many stores they have, but they have quite a number. And talking to their CEO recently, that business has been quite good. It's actually, in the past year, it's actually compensated for a loss in revenue because of their fuel industry, because they also run gas stations, right? And so because people are obviously staying home, etc., so they're not needing as much gasoline for their vehicles. But I'm wondering, the fact that you have a grocery chain, like, what impact does that have on, say, we're talking on prices, will that have an impact on the overall prices that a lot of these other stores will be charging?
Well, mass buying is always a benefit. The difference is that you have a regulator who has submitted themselves right in the middle of it. Like Fire and Flower has a partnership with Circle K, right, which has over 14,000 or 1,400 locations in Canada. Normally, when you have large purchasing volume, you get discounts. But again, the cannabis sector is treated like no other retail sector. You're not allowed inducements. You're not allowed to correct marketing rules. You're not allowed to do white labels. You're not allowed to do strategic purchase agreements. You're not allowed to do cost buys. So yes, it will happen, and we will see consolidation, and we will see the big players who have been waiting on the side come into the market. But you have to create a framework where it makes sense, and we're still not yet at that circumstance. 41.3%. What other product comes to market at 41.3%? That's bananas, right? So.
And one of our attendees today, just in the comments, wrote, he said it's not the illicit market that's necessarily the only problem, because in Ontario, the regulator is also an online competitor. And so, it's something for us to consider, is that there are many different forms of competition. I know we only have a few minutes left. There is one more question that was typed in that probably is more for Mara and maybe for Nathan as well. And we'll have a couple more minutes after this in case there are other questions, but I do want to get to all of the earlier questions. One of them has to do with advertising, specifically on for cannabis products. And the question is, it only looks like CBD ads are allowed, but not other cannabis products. Is that true? And maybe if you can talk, both of you, Mara and Nathan, if you want to talk a little bit about advertising and marketing restrictions around products, especially those with THC.
Yeah, for sure. So they are currently working on some of the marketing legislation, I know in Ontario, but it has to be age gated. So I think a lot of people are seeing like CBD ads because they're on websites like, your Weather Network app. I saw some CBD ads on there. But when it comes to a lot of the products, they have to be age gated. So you have to be advertising under the parameters that only people that are visiting that space are over the age of 19. But I know that there's been some changes in terms of marketing for retailers which is really, really exciting. So we're seeing that kind of boom, and they're loosening the regulations on that. So yeah.
Just if so the interesting thing is, technically, if CBD is not age gated, it is an illegal company. Primarily, that is actually the case because the regulatory regime for marketing, which is overseen by the Federal Cannabis Act, is so strict that it is very, very, very difficult to do. But one of the things that we, again, have to keep in quick consideration is first G20 country. It is much easier to give people something than take it away. So the thought was create a strict regime and then lessen it. And one of the things that we have to keep in consideration is this year, October 17 of 2021 is the three-year review of the Cannabis Act. And that review is going to be led and create an opportunity for the cannabis sector to ask for marketing rules that make sense and more comparison to other similar products like alcohol, for example. And if we could get half the way that alcohol has, it would be an incredibly different thing. You know, somebody comes in and asks, the fastest growing population is seniors who ask about three things: pain, sleep, and anxiety, of which retail cannabis, primarily for adult use recreation, can't talk about. That right there shows how difficult it is to actually answer those questions. So, you know, lots more has to go.
Great. Well, I know we're up against the hour. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if there are any last minute questions, please feel free to type them in. I would like to thank our panelists, Mara from Realm, RELM in Ontario from the cannabis retail side, Mario Tanaguzzi coming from the retail journalism side in Calgary. From Edmonton, we have Nathan Meissen, who is, of course, an expert in all things cannabis. And we have from the Netherlands, Dr. Alette Fleischer, who has been wonderful in sharing her expertise on the historical context of Tulip Mania. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and to thank our hosts at Cannabis for allowing us to come here and have this conversation. Have a great day, everyone.